Hello, and welcome to Week 4 of the Introduction 2020 Faculty Perspective Series. We've designed these programs to allow you to see the tremendous depth and breadth of academic and research interests amongst our faculty, and for you to preview many of the exciting things that you can study at the University of Oregon. Over the course of the summer, we are presenting faculty perspectives in 5 separate tracks that highlight the interdisciplinary nature of big questions. In our 5 programs today, we have featured the School of Law, 2 departments within the College of Arts and Sciences, and this one from the Lundquist College of Business. As a reminder to you students who are watching, be sure you complete your reflection on this program after we're done by visiting community.uoregon.edu. Additionally, the last 15 minutes of this session will be dedicated to answering your questions live on camera. If you're watching in Zoom, please use the Q&A feature on the bottom of your Zoom screen to ask questions of our presenter. Today's faculty perspectives in the Innovation and Entrepreneurship track will address cryptocurrency and whether we need it. I'm pleased to welcome Associate Professor of Finance, Stephen McKeon. Welcome, Professor McKeon.
Thanks so much for having me, Cora.
It's all yours.
Terrific. So the title of this talk is What is Cryptocurrency and Why Do We Need It? I'm an Associate Professor of Finance at the Lundquist School of Business here at University of Oregon. I thought I would start by just giving you a little background on how I ended up studying this topic. So I've been a professor here for about 8 or 9 years, teaching finance, various segments within finance, valuation, fundamentals, and so on. But I've also been involved in technology and innovation and entrepreneurship since the very beginning of my career. So I actually graduated from Oregon about 20 years ago, and I immediately moved to Silicon Valley and joined a startup. And then more recently, I co-founded a startup with some students called Skyward, and we went through the whole phase from birth to funding to exit. And so if you marry up finance and the emerging sort of side of technology, what you end up with is crypto. And so this is my main focus these days, are blockchains and cryptocurrency. Outside of the classroom, I also advise a fund called Collaborative Fund that is deploying capital, sort of a crypto venture capitalist, if you will. So I've seen the industry from a lot of different angles and excited to tell you a little bit about it today. So the main thing I'm known for is something called tokenized securities. So this is the idea of putting real assets like stocks or bonds or real estate on blockchains. But that's sort of an advanced topic. And before we get to that, we're just going to talk about generally what is a blockchain, what is cryptocurrency. So when I'm doing this in person, I always take a poll. So I thought I'd do it here, even though I can't see your hands. The first question I usually ask is, how many people have heard of Bitcoin? And of course, it's interesting, when I first started doing this, say 5 years ago, not very many hands went up. These days, when I ask that question, virtually every hand goes up. Practically everybody has heard of Bitcoin at this point. But then I move on to the next question of how many of you have used Bitcoin? And of course, the number is much fewer. Right? And then when you get to the last question of how many of you have used a cryptocurrency other than Bitcoin, the number is even fewer yet. And so I think that that's going to change a lot over the next decade, and so I'm just going to provide you a little bit of foundation today. So where I always start teaching about this topic is I ask the question, what is a ledger? Because ledgers are fundamental to blockchains. And a ledger is something we've all heard about, right? We've heard about it in an accounting context. It's just a list of events or transactions. So what might we record on a ledger? We would record who the buyer is, who the seller is, how much did they pay for it, and when did the transaction occur. So sort of those 4 key fundamental pieces of information. We, of course, can also record a lot of other things on ledgers. Ledgers are not a new concept. Ledgers have been around since the beginning of society. You can go back and find clay tablets from Mesopotamia. You move through, we eventually developed double entry bookkeeping. In more recent eras, of course, we've got spreadsheets, and so spreadsheets keep track of a lot of ledgers. But the key thing about ledgers is that they allow society to reach a consensus about facts, right? If I want to know any fact, like how much money is in my bank account, who owns that piece of property, all of these types of things, the way we establish that as a society is we go to the ledger that's keeping track of ownership for that particular asset. And so they're a really key piece of the way society has developed in terms of reaching consensus. So the key question to ask is who maintains the ledger? That is what sets blockchains apart. Because right now, the way most ledgers are maintained is a centralized party keeps track of the ledger. So in the case of how much money do I have in my bank account, the entity that keeps track of that ledger is the bank, right? If I want to know what sort of stock transaction happened, like I sold 100 shares of Microsoft and we need some sort of validation of that, we have a whole apparatus of intermediaries to take care of that. Things like the DTC and stock exchanges and broker-dealers. If we want to know who owns a piece of real estate, the entity that keeps track of that in the United States is often the county, right? So I would go to the county recorder and look back at who owned this piece of property at various points in time. And so the difference with blockchains is that instead of the ledger being maintained by a single entity, it's maintained by a crowd. And so we call these nodes. And so it's effectively a bunch of computers running the same software at the same time. And that's how we reach consensus and we maintain the ledger. Now that's a really powerful concept that I'll get to in a minute, but first I want to contrast it with how do things work in the banking system, just to give you a mental model. So say that Bob wants to make a payment to Alice, right? And so, or vice versa. We'll say Alice made a payment to Bob. So Alice writes a check to Bob. What does Bob do? He goes and he deposits in his bank. Maybe that's Bank of America. But Bank of America doesn't know how much money is in Alice's account because it's at a different bank. Let's say it's at Wells Fargo. And so as a society, we've created this apparatus where Bank of America's ledger and Wells Fargo ledger can talk to each other. And that could be the Federal Reserve or correspondent banking, but basically this check has to go up through the system. And what happens when Wells Fargo gets this check? Well, they need to confirm two things. They have to say, did Alice actually write this check? And is there enough money in Alice's account to pay this check? And if those two things are satisfied, then Wells Fargo issues the payment and they send it back up through this system, back over to Bank of America, and then Bank of America credits Bob's account, right? And so most of us, all we know is we deposit the check and then magically the balance goes up, right? But what I'm trying to get at is there is this whole apparatus that actually makes that happen. And payment processing really boils down to two things. It boils down to authentication and authorization. So authentication is like that first question I asked. Did the payment actually come from Alice or the account owner? And this, how do we do this? In the banking, it's like verifying the signature on a check. When you open a checking account, you have to go in, you have to sign a card. And if there was ever a dispute, they would compare the signature on the check to the signature on that card to verify that it's the same. Authorization is like saying, is there enough money in the account to actually make the payment? And so here's where they have to check their ledger and they say, all right, there is enough money, we're going to debit it and send it through the chain back over to whoever deposited the check. So imagine if there was only one bank in the world, right? It's commonly been noted that having this whole apparatus and all of these separate ledgers, which kind of silos information in many different places, it's actually very costly. It's costly to reconcile, it's costly to operate. So what if we just had one ledger? It's effectively like one bank. Now, we've created a lot of efficiency, but we now have a new problem. And the new problem is who controls the all-powerful bank, right? And so it's very unlikely that everyone in the world could agree on any single entity to control all of the world's money, right? Because even if you could get a whole country agreeing, like maybe everyone in the US agrees the Federal Reserve is going to maintain this ledger. But are the people in Russia or China or Venezuela, or you could think of other countries and they might say, well, we're not going to trust our bank accounts to an entity in another country. And so it's actually a real issue to try and find a single entity that could maintain a single ledger. And so what we actually need is a network maintaining the ledger where no individual actor has unilateral control. And so that is effectively the way Bitcoin works. And so we call these nodes miners. You may have heard of Bitcoin miners. The easiest way to think about that is they're just accountants, right? They're processing transactions, they're updating the ledger of who owns what, and they get paid for doing that service. That's effectively what Bitcoin miners are. Same thing as banks do. So let's see how Bitcoin works, because that is the example that most people have heard of. And so to own a Bitcoin means to own the right to transfer it. So pause for a moment and think, what does ownership actually mean? This is an exercise we go through in my class, right? Like, what does it mean to own something? And when you boil it down, ownership is just a set of rights. It gives you a right to do something, right? So if I have a dollar bill and I own that dollar bill, I have the right to spend it, to transfer it to somebody else, and maybe they give me some sort of good or service in return. If I own my house, I also have access rights probably, right? I can enter the premises and live in my house. If I own shares of Microsoft, I don't have access rights. Like, I can't walk on Microsoft's campus and sort of like inspect their offices. So different types of ownership have different sets of rights. And in the case of Bitcoin, the primary right is the ability to transfer it to somebody else. So much like a US dollar. So the way you do this is with something called a private key. And we're not going to get into any technical details today. It's something we would dive a little bit deeper into in my class. You could kind of think of it like a password. Now, where do you hold these private keys? You hold it in something called a wallet, a digital wallet. And this, maybe the closest analogy is something like a bank account, right? It's the place where you hold access to your assets. Now, what is Bitcoin? That is a very long topic, but maybe I can give you just a scratch the surface idea. So Satoshi Nakamoto invented Bitcoin by writing a white paper and posting it to a mailing list. And it described how the Bitcoin blockchain protocol works. Now, interestingly, he or she or they have never identified themselves. We actually don't know the real world identity of the person that invented Bitcoin. Why not? Why wouldn't you want credit for what has turned out to be one of the greatest financial innovations, certainly in the last decade, perhaps longer? Well, the answer is because there actually were a lot of predecessors to Bitcoin. Bitcoin was not the first digital currency. There was DigiCash, which you can see by the awesome icon, was like 1980s, right? There was eGold, there was Liberty Reserve. There was lots of efforts to establish a digital currency prior to Bitcoin. But what happened to all of these? None of these exist anymore. Ultimately, they all failed. So they were either shut down by regulators or they went bankrupt because they were a corporation, right? And so the key thing about Bitcoin to understand is it's not a company. There is no headquarters of Bitcoin. All Bitcoin is a software program. All Bitcoin is a software program that's being run on thousands of machines at the same time to keep track of who owns what. There is no company called Bitcoin. So this idea that we can now move value peer-to-peer is really powerful because a huge segment of society is built around clearinghouses or intermediation, right? So in the past, when we transfer things of value, we usually use an intermediary. Now we can transfer them from person to person. And there's many, many, many different applications of that, way beyond Bitcoin, right? So let me now turn to like a couple more advanced topics. So one is the idea of traditional asset tokenization. So when we transfer things like stocks or real estate or interests in private equity funds, we almost always use an intermediary for those things. Now we're talking about the idea of representing those things on blockchains and potentially massively automating and making more efficient the way that value moves. The bigger category is perhaps called DeFi, or decentralized finance. And right now, as we speak, virtually the entire field of finance is being reimagined, right? The way lending is done, the way trading of assets is done, the way projects raise capital, the way you take out cover or insurance, the way you make payments. All of these things are being replicated and automated in a digital and peer-to-peer and sort of trustless way. That is the cutting edge of finance. And so to me, this is why you go to a major university, a major research university like Oregon, is because we can expose you to sort of like the cutting edge of the research on a lot of these topics. And in my field, finance, this is the cutting edge. The idea that we are now replicating all of the things that financial services does, which is a huge industry on the globe, in a way that is going to be substantially more efficient and probably produce a lot more consumer surplus. So the final topic I just want to talk about is the idea of trust. So when you boil blockchains and crypto down, it almost always comes to this down to this idea of trust. Because as I mentioned before, when we transfer most assets, and whether that's currency, whether it's stocks and bonds, real estate, anything you want to transfer of value almost always uses an intermediary. The one exception to that is cash, right? I can take a dollar bill out of my wallet, I can hand it to you, no intermediary. That's a peer-to-peer transfer. But almost everything else, even if we want to make an electronic payment of cash, requires an intermediary. Now, the problem is intermediaries extract value. And what blockchains are doing is fundamentally altering the cost structure and the nature of producing trust. So here's a quick example from just a few months ago. Everything on blockchains is visible, and so we can see all of the transactions. And here's a transaction where somebody moved about $1 billion of value in the form of Bitcoin for a transaction fee of 67 cents. There is no electronic value transfer mechanism in the world that can possibly compete with that. Moving that amount of money via PayPal would cost about $27 million. And so these are really powerful systems once they reach scale. So if you look back in history, so I'm always a student of history, I'm always trying to understand, like, what is it about blockchains that's changing the way trust is being produced, and where did that come from? Why do we need it? Back to the original question. So if you go back to 1840, I know it was a long time ago, right? And you think about, like, how did economic activity happen? Because we need trust for economic activity. What you realize is that way back in the day, it was mostly repeated transactions, right? Like, I dealt with the same person that sold me meat and vegetables, and like maybe that person's parents sold meat and vegetables to my parents, and you had people in very tight geographic regions. They didn't travel that much, and very frequently the transactions were repeated with the same parties, and so trust was established. But then a major technological shock happened, and that shock was the steam engine, and later the combustible engine. And what this did is it massively reduced the price of transportation. And so how does that affect economic activity? Well, you can see from these charts, in 1840 we had almost no railroad, right? And then over the next sort of 50 years, we had hundreds of thousands of miles of railroad. And if you go back to 1820, 1830, immigration was actually quite low. It was very expensive to immigrate across the ocean. But then the steamship was invented, and all of a sudden people could travel across the ocean for a fraction of the price, and immigration skyrocketed. So what did this do to our economic environment? Well, it all of a sudden allowed us to transact at distance, right? So now I didn't just have to deal with the people in my neighborhood. I could produce something in New York and ship it to Chicago. Also, the market participants, all these new people coming into the country, was now much more heterogeneous. So I didn't have that repeated transaction history with anyone. And so all of a sudden, society said, well, this way we produce trust, it doesn't really exist anymore. And maybe I don't trust that person in Chicago to actually pay me. So we need some solution to that, right? And the solution were institutions. So if you look at all the institutions that regulate and produce trust, many of them rose up right during this period, right? So I'm talking about things like the banking system. I'm talking about the insurance industry. I'm talking about securities regulations, everything that allows society to produce trust for economic activity. All those institutional sources sort of came to be right after the shock of the steam engine. Now, we've had another technological shock, which is the internet, right? And it seems like a long time ago probably for a lot of the students on this call, but really in the grand scheme of things, it wasn't that long ago, right? It was maybe a little over 20 years ago, almost nobody had an email address. And so all of a sudden now we have this shock to our information environment, our contracting environment. Just like the steam engine, now we can move goods at much greater distance at a very low cost, right? Like I could produce something here in Eugene, Oregon, and if it's a digital good, I could send it to somebody in London or wherever at effectively no cost, right? Like it's an email. And so all of a sudden this has really shocked the economic environment, because most of the ways we produce trust are unique to a jurisdiction, right? If you think about our securities laws, those are unique to the US. If you think of the way the banking system works, it's primarily within a political boundary. And so all these trust production mechanisms, they don't link up really well globally. And so the way we look at it is that blockchains have effectively risen up and been invented to address this issue primarily. The idea that more and more, whether it's labor, right? Labor now moves digitally at great distance for very little cost. We're seeing that even more in COVID, right? Because like anybody who can do work via Zoom could be located sort of anywhere. And so all of a sudden, blockchains have risen up to be able to solve that trust environment in a way that the institutional mechanisms that we've been relying on for the last 150 years are not able to do as efficiently. Okay, so I will just sort of wrap up with a few sort of predictions about the way we see things going, those of us who are doing research in this field. So we believe that all currencies will be digitized, including the US dollar. So that's already happening in terms of people producing private versions of the US dollar. So we call those stable coins. I think the point I'm trying to make here is that the thing that everyone's heard of is Bitcoin, but this industry, the crypto economy as we call it, is substantially bigger than Bitcoin, right? It will affect all of finance in time. And so the next move, we've already created an asset that basically replicates a dollar. The next move is for an actual government to put their currency on chain. And there's already movements. I don't think the US is going to be the first one to do that, but there's already movements in a variety of countries to do that exact thing. Within 10 years, nearly everyone on this call will have a digital wallet. So when I started my career, or I should say when I was in your seat, right? I also went to the University of Oregon. So in 1995, actually not that many people had email addresses, if you can believe there was such a time, right? So in 1994, 1995, there was a big shock, which was AOL, America Online, and then all of a sudden a lot of people had email addresses. But in the early 90s, almost nobody had an email address. We think that's effectively the stage we're at with digital wallets. Right now, not that many of you probably have a digital wallet. Some probably do. I do, right? But in 10 years from now, if it is the predominant way that we move value, you will get your paycheck in a digital wallet. You will make your payments out of a digital wallet. It'll be integrated into your phone. It'll be integrated into your browser. You might have multiple digital wallets and they might interact with each other. That is one of the things we're definitely looking for over the next decade. The last point I make is just that the rate of evolution in crypto is faster than any new technology I've witnessed. I've been involved in technology since the very beginning of my career, right during the dot-com boom. And the rate of iteration in this space is amazing, right? And so let me tell you how you can get involved. Oregon Blockchain is a student-led organization right here on campus, assuming that we're all on campus, right? And I'm sure that they're holding meetings virtually, if not. And they focus not only here on the school, but also even on the wider region. So they've done conferences up in Portland. They've interacted with the Stanford Blockchain Club. And so the way to find them is, one, you could just Google Oregon Blockchain LinkedIn. You'll be taken to their LinkedIn page where you could get in contact. The other thing is to just email their president. So it's a guy by the name of Ryan T. He's got a great email address, rat@uoregon.edu, which should be easy to remember. And so you could just email him and ask, like, how can I get involved? When is the next meeting? And he'll be able to provide you all that information. And so even if you weren't to take a finance class where I kind of go through these things in more detail, there are extracurricular opportunities for you to learn more if you're so inclined. So let me just leave with one concept, which is I talked about this idea of trust and the idea that when trust breaks down, then blockchains potentially can step into some of those gaps. And we're seeing trust erode all around us, right? Whether it's in the news or whether it's with banks, or you can think of like financial and non-financial areas where we're seeing trust in society break down. And so one of the, I wanted to bring an artifact just to share with you. And so we have this bill from Zimbabwe, right? And if you can read it, it says $100 trillion. And this is what happens when trust in a currency breaks down. All right, and Zimbabwe is not the only example. We have examples from Greece, from Germany, from Yugoslavia. Right now it's sort of going on in Venezuela. Is that when governments print a substantial amount of currency and the population loses faith in it, then that can have some really bad ramifications in terms of inflation and in some cases hyperinflation. And so some people would point to cryptocurrencies with fixed supplies as one potential remedy. And so those are the types of questions we talk about and we debate and we try to determine what's myth and what's fiction and what's fact in my courses. So maybe I'll pause there and see if you have any questions.
They do, in fact, have questions. So thank you so much for that. And we have a couple that you touched on a little bit, but I do want to make sure that we get to them. Ryan asks, I know many countries like China have gone to only using online currency to be able to purchase items by using WeChat and Alipay. Do you think the United States will also transition to this model for payments? And when do you think this will happen?
Sure. So when we talk about electronic payments, it's important to distinguish that there's a couple different ways to enact that. So let's take something like PayPal or Venmo. Those are effectively layers on top of our banking system, right? And so you move money in and out of your banks onto PayPal, it replicates a dollar, it integrates with the banking system very well, whereas payments with cryptocurrency, so we have something called a stable coin, it replicates a dollar. But one important thing to understand is that is an entirely parallel system of value transfer. It's not necessarily a layer on top of the banking system. And so we're already seeing electronic payments grow substantially in the US with things like Apple Pay. I would agree that, so I was in China about 3 years ago, and it was amazing. I was at like a convenience store, something equivalent to like a 7-Eleven. And every single person that walked up to the counter just held up their phone, and they were using things like Alipay and WeChat. And I felt very odd actually using currency. I was like the only person in the line that was using currency. And so I do think we're going to continue to see electronic payments of all types continue to grow. I think that we will see things like Apple Pay certainly get a lot more adoption before we see things like stablecoins get adoption. But at the end of the day, because cryptocurrencies are programmatic, which means that we can put certain types of logic into the payment, right? So only make the payment if X, Y, and Z happens. They're going to be a lot more flexible in terms of features that we can deliver in these apps. And so long term, we do see the blockchain-based methods of value transfer probably dominating, but that would be more in the longer term. In the near term, I think it's going to be things like Apple Pay.
Thank you. Zach is wondering, is cryptocurrency more or less secure to things such as hacking or fraud compared to systems such as banks?
Great question. So the one thing to differentiate here is that there's a difference between like an exchange or a wallet getting hacked and the cryptocurrency itself getting hacked. So when you read about Bitcoin hacks in the news, people often think, oh, the Bitcoin system has been compromised again. In fact, Bitcoin has never been hacked, right? So 10 years, it's been running over 10 years at this point, is effectively never been hacked. When you read about money or Bitcoin getting stolen, what has happened is that somebody who's holding a lot of Bitcoin has had their system compromised. So for example, maybe I want to trade Bitcoin on an exchange, and so now I don't hold my keys anymore. I give my private keys or my passwords effectively to the exchange. And so exchanges are holding a whole bunch of assets all at once. And if a hacker can get access inside of them, it would be sort of like if somebody got the password to your bank account, right? And went in and stole US dollars out of your account. We wouldn't say the US dollar's been hacked. We would say Bank of America's been hacked or whatever the banking system is. So it's very similar in that way. A key thing to remember with cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin is that they are effectively bearer assets. That means if you hold them, if you hold the private keys, you hold the right to spend and transfer them. Unlike perhaps other methods of electronic value transfer where we can actually rewind it. So there's pros and cons to that, which we probably don't have time to dive into very deeply here. But I would say that there's a saying among a lot of the people in the crypto industry, which is not your keys, not your coins, which means that you should maintain possession and custody of your assets, or else be very sure that whoever you're allowing to custody your assets has the right security measures in place.
Thank you. Kyle wants to know, what are the most exciting reasons to become involved with digital currencies?
Yeah, so I would say the most exciting reasons are primarily that this is just the direction the world is moving. So particularly if you have an interest in finance, knowing something about blockchains and cryptocurrencies is going to serve you well in your career, even if you don't work directly with them, because you're going to continue to bump up against them. I should also mention that blockchains are being used for more than just financial applications. I, of course, focus on financial applications because I'm a finance professor. But you're also seeing them being integrated into things like supply chains and various other segments of business. And so we sort of briefly touch on those in some of my classes just so that everybody's aware of them. But in my case, I focus primarily on the financial applications. And if you buy into the idea that everybody's going to have a digital wallet in 10 years, then you can only imagine the amount of opportunity that opens up for people your age, for people right at the beginning of their careers, in terms of helping to shape the way value moves in the future, because it's all going to be reinvented over the next decade. It's just fascinating.
It sounds a little bit like folks coming out of college during the dot-com boom, like the opportunities there are going to be pretty substantial.
That's right. So I graduated in 2000. So it was the peak of the dot-com boom. And it felt like anything was possible. All of a sudden, we had this new technology, and we could put sort of anything online. And of course, at these emergent stages of new technologies, what we see is that people try everything. And so the poster child from that era was pets.com, right? Let's put pet food online and allow people to buy pet food online. But it turned out pet food was heavy, and the costs were sort of not sufficient in terms of what people would be willing to bear. And so we had a lot of money poured in to early internet companies that subsequently failed. And certainly we've seen the same thing in blockchain. So in 2017, there was an era that we call the ICO boom. So initial coin offering is what ICO stands for. And all of a sudden people were trying to do anything and everything with blockchain. And a lot of those things didn't make sense. But what we're seeing is like experimentation at these emergent stages is sort of a classic stage that every emergent technology goes through. And so we saw it in 2017. We're seeing it again right now with financial services. So DeFi is sort of like the hottest segment of crypto right now. And it's people trying to envision every type of financial service. How can we automate this and make it cheaper, faster, and better? And usually that means decentralized and peer-to-peer. And so there's just enormous experimentation going on around incentives and trying to shape the way users interact with these systems. And it's just, it does feel a lot like when I graduated back in 2000.
Thank you. Another Stephen wants to know, do you think blockchain could become obsolete by the creation of a new system, or is it here to stay?
Yeah, so there are other mechanisms to achieve consensus. And the way I always answer this type of question is that, we have something called a hash graph, and there's a bunch of other technological solutions I won't kind of go through in detail, but I will say they are sort of like evolutions of blockchain in a sense. So one problem that blockchains have right now is that the largest versions of them, so Bitcoin, or some of you might be familiar with something called Ethereum, they're actually pretty slow, all right? So they can process, 7 transactions a second or 12 transactions a second. In comparison, Visa can process, I think, 30 or 40,000 transactions a second. And so there is a lot of iteration that's been going on really for the last decade in order to try to make these things faster, but remain as secure as what we've observed Bitcoin being over the last decade. And so I have no doubt that the technology is going to continue to evolve, and maybe we continue to call it blockchain, or maybe we come up with new names for some of these sort of subsequent iterations of what started out as blockchain. But what is without question to me is that these mechanisms of achieving consensus with a crowd and maintaining ledgers in that way are here to stay.
Thank you. Christine wants to know, what would occur to the economy if technology fails, assuming society is solely reliant on cryptocurrency?
Yes, another question we think about a lot, right? So Ethereum right now is sort of the dominant platform for what we call smart contracts. And the way we execute a lot of these DeFi services is with something called smart contracts. It's a way of programmatically moving value. So it's if you think of like a share of stock on a piece of paper is not very smart, right? It's just a piece of paper. But if we were to represent that share of stock on chain, now we could program a bunch of logic into it. We could say, only transfer it to this person if the payment has been made, and if that person lives in an acceptable jurisdiction, and if they're a accredited investor. Like we could put effectively if-then statements that regulate the transfer of assets. Now, if all of that stuff gets built on a single platform, let's take Ethereum, and Ethereum itself is subject to attack, that's potentially an issue. And that's not a subject I can dive much deeper than just saying that. But it is a subject we talk about in my class because people are thinking about how do we make these things secure for the long run, yet maintain all the benefits of keeping it decentralized. And those things are not easy to solve sometimes.
Okay, so Stephen, I'm sorry, next question. Tyler, what will give cryptocurrencies actual value?
So what gives cryptocurrency, I guess I should start by saying there's all kinds of different cryptocurrencies representing all kinds of different things. So let me start with the easiest one, which is something like a stable coin. So we have examples like Tether or USDC or True USD. There's a bunch of different versions of these things. And what they do is this is one model anyway, is, I give them $1, they take the dollar, they put it in a bank or wherever they're going to hold it, and then they issue one stable coin to me. And so that coin always represents the idea that there's $1 sitting somewhere that is backing that coin. So you can have asset-backed cryptocurrencies, and that's pretty clear in terms of where the value derives from. But the more complicated one, or the one that people often will point to, is something like Bitcoin. So where does Bitcoin's value come from? And the question I always pose to my class when that question comes up is, where does gold's value come from, right? Because gold is effectively a rock. It's a shiny rock, and the reason that we value it the way we do at thousands of dollars an ounce is because society has agreed that that's what the value is. And there are some uses as well, right? You can make it into jewelry, you can use it in electronics, but those uses don't justify anything near the value at which it trades. It trades at that value because society has agreed that we're going to store wealth in this mechanism, and that collectively it's just a market outcome. It's what people are willing to buy and sell it for. Bitcoin is really no different. There are uses, right? We can use it for payments. We can use it to secure certain types of transactions and facilitate various micropayments. But what a lot of people do is they just store their wealth in it, right? Or some portion of their wealth, right? So, don't go put your life savings into Bitcoin. But a lot of people are starting to put 1% of their assets or 2% of their assets into these types of currencies. And the value derives primarily as a market outcome from what society believes. So if tomorrow everyone decided Bitcoin wasn't worth anything, Bitcoin wouldn't be worth anything. But that's exactly the same as gold. If tomorrow everyone decided that we don't care about shiny yellow rocks, the value of gold wouldn't be very high either. And so it's a very similar dynamic.
Thank you. You mentioned one of the student organizations that students can be a part of. Are there others in the finance area that you think that students could benefit from participating in?
Yeah, so we have a variety of clubs within the business school that people cater to a bunch of different interests. There's a club that focuses on real estate. There's an undergraduate investment group that students can apply to. There is a larger group called the FMA, so the Financial Management Organization, or Financial Management Association, that brings in a bunch of guest speakers, maybe by Zoom, maybe in person. And so I would say that some of those are, certainly all of those are open to business students. Many of them are open university-wide. So the University of Oregon Investment Group will take applications from anybody on campus. And actually one of the unique things about that group is having students from biology and chemistry and computer science. And so when you're trying to evaluate a stock, that has maybe a particular medical aspect or a particular technological aspect. You might have somebody in the room that has a little bit more expertise than perhaps most other business students would. And so I think that the diversity of sort of viewpoints in some of those groups is a huge source of their value.
Thank you. Okay, so one of the things that we want to talk about, actually we've talked about with many of the faculty members, are there research opportunities for undergraduates, either with you or within your department, that you can speak to?
Yeah, so research opportunities for undergrads are primarily on a case-by-case basis. I have taken on undergrads in the past to help with research. In fact, when I was an undergrad here at University of Oregon, worked with a professor on a research project. It's partly why I eventually became a professor, because I can tell you that when I was in college, being a professor was not on my radar whatsoever. But right when I was a senior, I did this research report, or I worked on a research project, I would say, that eventually was published, and kind of watched it go through that process and watched, you know, the debate around different questions and how to frame different findings, and it really fascinated me. And so I try to provide those opportunities if I have a student that is really interested in a particular subject. It of course has to match up with the stage of the project, and that they, you know, if they have a particular skill, like they can code in Python, then maybe I can have them do one thing. And so it definitely has to be a match, I would say. But certainly there are research opportunities if you seek them out.
Thank you. Are there other experiential opportunities for students in this area? You talked about clubs, and we've addressed research. Are there other ways that students can get experience or firsthand knowledge in this area?
So, I mean, we encourage all of our students to do internships in the summer. That's probably the single best way to get experience, is that, you know, every summer you have this break, and think about it this way. You're at the very beginning of your academic career, right? So you've got a set number of summers between you and the end of this path. Make sure you use them really wisely, right? Like, you could try different things. Like, maybe, I mean, finance, for example, is a broad field. Like, you could try one segment of finance between your freshman and sophomore year. You can try a different segment of finance between your sophomore and junior year. And then between your junior and senior year, that internship is targeted towards getting you the job upon graduation. So many companies these days are actually hiring out of their internship programs predominantly, meaning that the key thing is to get that internship between your junior and senior year, because that's where they're going to do the bulk of their hiring. I would say other ways sort of on campus, I can only speak to the business school, but I know that we have a job shadow program, right, where they can match you up with somebody in a particular industry, and maybe you shadow them for a day or a week, or I think there's different sort of ways that that's administered. But that's through our career services group. So we have a group right on the first floor of Lillis called More Career Services, and they could tell you more about that. And then we have all these clubs, whether it's real estate, the investment group, and that effectively is trying to replicate a certain type of experience as well.
Thank you. I have one more question for you. Actually, you mentioned about traveling to China and having that experience of being the only person that paid in a currency. What do you think the value of any international study that a student might take part in could have on something like cryptocurrency or the area of finance in general?
Yeah, so just to clarify, the question was about international students sort of engaging with these topics?
No, American students who might have a study abroad experience or do an international internship. Is there added value to doing some of these learning opportunities in another country?
Absolutely, like highly recommended, right? Because, I mean, one, it's just a great life experience, which I think sort of makes you a better rounded person, and actually is probably going to help you get a job down the road and that type of thing. But then even specifically within finance, different segments of the world, I mean, we are becoming more and more globalized, but rates of adoption are very different in different segments of the world, right? If you look at adoption of cryptocurrency within Korea, it's multiple times higher than the US, right? And same thing with China, although in China maybe it's adopted for a different reason, which is like evading capital controls. And so we talk about some of those things in my class, but being able to go to some of these countries and sort of just see the way different types of technologies, whether it be fintech or just technology in general, is adopted and used. Like I know that I've had friends who went to Japan and were just amazed that like there were QR codes on everything, right? And we don't really we're starting to use QR codes a little bit more in the US, but there's certainly other countries that are just way ahead of us in terms of that type of adoption. And so I think getting some of those experiences and getting out of your comfort zone and just seeing the way a different culture operates and interacts with technology is a really useful experience.
Thank you for that. That's all the time that we have for this session. For those of you watching, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. Again, students, be sure to log on to community.uoregon.edu to submit your reflections and stay on track to complete introduction. Other ways that you can continue to stay on track to be ready for fall include uploading your selfie for your UOID card. We will be mailing those in just a few weeks in August. We want you to check your @uoregon.edu email address every single day. Keep an eye out for information about room selection, which is coming up very quickly. We want you to complete your financial aid checklist if you have one. And of course, I would like you to be sure that you set reminders for yourself to have your final transcript sent to the U of O and submit your immunization records to the health center. For links to find out more or to complete these steps, I encourage you to visit our website at orientation.uoregon.edu, and you can click on the next steps to find all the information you need on these things. For other questions about introduction, this program, or any other introduction program, you can email us at orientation@uoregon.edu or text us at 541-346-1159. If you'd like to learn more about the next step in introduction, which is academic advising, and what it means at the U of O, please listen to tomorrow's episode of Flock Talk from your favorite podcast platform, or you can listen at flocktalk.uoregon.edu. Again, thank you so much for your time today, and to you, Professor McKeon, thank you for helping our new ducks get ready for fall.
Sounds good. See you soon.